In the silent, crushing depths of the Pacific Ocean, a predator reigned supreme. It was a ghost, a titan of steel longer than a football field, capable of disappearing for months only to reappear and deliver a fatal, unseen blow. This was the Japanese I-class submarine, the apex predator of an underwater kingdom. Its commanders were the elite, the samurai of the sea, who by 1943 had honed their skills to a razor's edge, confident in their machines, their training, and their deadly Type 95 torpedoes. They believed they were untouchable, masters of a three-dimensional battlefield their enemies could barely comprehend. They were wrong. In the late spring of that year, something shifted in the fundamental laws of underwater warfare. In a span of just 12 days, a period of time barely long enough for a patrol to settle into its routine, 7 of these magnificent steel predators vanished. 7 experienced crews, over 500 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest submariners, were erased from existence. They didn't fall in epic battles against fleets of warships. They weren't hunted by swarms of aircraft. They were killed by something new, something quiet and deceptively small. A weapon that looked less like a modern instrument of war and more like a bizarre metallic sea urchin. They called it the Hedgehog. This is not simply the story of a new weapon. This is the story of a historical domino effect, a chain reaction of desperation, ingenuity, and fatal arrogance that would upend the balance of power in the world's largest ocean. It's the story of how a nation on the brink of starvation in the Atlantic forged a weapon that would become the undoing of a Pacific empire. How did this strange, porcupine-like mortar achieve what massive depth-charge barrages could not? And more importantly, why did the Japanese, a nation of brilliant naval innovators, sail blindly into a technological trap that would cost them everything? To understand the fall, we must first understand the height from which they fell. By 1943, the Imperial Japanese Submarine Service, the Sentai Suikaku, was a force born of a unique and aggressive naval doctrine. Unlike the German U-boat fleet, which was built primarily to strangle enemy commerce in a war of attrition, the Japanese submarine was conceived as a fleet weapon. Its primary mission wasn't to sink lonely merchantmen, but to stalk and kill the most valuable prey of all, enemy aircraft carriers and battleships. This doctrine shaped every aspect of their design and deployment. The I-class submarines were genuine underwater cruisers. Some were so large they could carry their own reconnaissance floatplanes, launched from a catapult on the forward deck. They possessed astonishing range, capable of crossing the Pacific, operating off the American West Coast, and returning to Japan without refueling. Their crews were the cream of the crop, subjected to a training regimen of brutal intensity that weeded out all but the most physically and psychologically resilient. To be a Japanese submariner was to be part of an elite warrior class, instilled with a belief in their own spiritual and technological superiority. This belief was not unfounded. They wielded the Type 95 torpedo, a weapon so far ahead of its Allied counterparts that it was almost supernatural. Larger, faster, with a longer range and a more powerful warhead than any American or British torpedo, the Type 95 was a genuine ship killer. It was nicknamed the Long Lance, and it had earned its reputation in the blood and fire of numerous surface engagements. In the hands of a skilled submarine commander, it was a death sentence delivered from the depths. This combination of advanced submarines, superior torpedoes, and elite crews created a powerful institutional confidence, a belief that they had perfected the art of underwater combat. This confidence, however, was about to become their Achilles' heel. It was a fortress of pride built on a foundation that was about to be shattered by a tremor from the other side of the world. Thousands of miles away, in the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic, another nation was fighting for its life against a different submarine menace. Great Britain, in 1940 and 1941, was being slowly strangled by the German U-boat wolf packs of Karl Dönitz. The happy time, as German submariners called it, saw Allied shipping losses reach catastrophic levels. The island nation, utterly dependent on convoys for food, fuel, and weapons, was facing the very real prospect of starvation and defeat. The primary tool for fighting back was the depth charge, a weapon that was far more terrifying than it was effective. Imagine you are the captain of a British destroyer in 1941. Your sonar operator, his ears pressed to his headset, reports a faint contact. Ping, ping, a U-boat. The hunt begins. You maneuver your ship, trying to pinpoint the submarine's location, its speed, its depth. The U-boat commander, hearing your propeller beats growing louder, dives deep, changes course, and hopes for the best. To attack, you must increase speed and pass directly over his suspected position. But in that final, crucial moment, the forward-looking sonar, known as ASDIC, loses its target. The water churned by your own ship's propellers creates a blind spot directly beneath you. You are now attacking based on a memory, a guess. The command is given. Fire pattern Delta. Huge barrel-shaped charges roll off the stern and are blasted from side-mounted throwers. They sink into the cold sea, their hydrostatic fuses set to detonate at an estimated depth. The ocean erupts in colossal plumes of white water. The concussion slams against your hull like a giant's fist. Inside the U-boat, the world becomes a living hell of groaning steel, shattering light bulbs, and the terrifying, deafening roar of the explosions. It is psychological warfare at its most brutal. But more often than not, it was just that. Noise and terror. The charges had to explode within roughly 20 feet of the pressure hull to cause fatal damage. It was like trying to hit a moving fly with a shotgun blast from a moving platform while blindfolded. The statistics were abysmal. It could take hundreds of depth charges, an entire ship's magazine, to secure a single kill. For every U-boat sunk, dozens escaped, emboldened by their survival and ready to kill again. This frustrating, inefficient dance of death was driving Allied commanders to despair. The problem was fundamental. You had to lose contact with the enemy at the exact moment you attacked. It was from this crucible of desperation that a revolutionary idea was born. It came from a little-known, wonderfully named branch of the Admiralty called the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. These were the boffins, the backroom inventors tasked with creating unconventional solutions to life-or-death problems. They looked at the infantry mortar, a simple weapon that lobbed a shell in a high arc, and asked a paradigm-shifting question. What if, instead of dropping charges behind us, we could fire a pattern of smaller charges ahead of us, while we still held the submarine in our sonar beam? The concept was staggeringly simple and utterly brilliant. It solved the blind spot problem in a single stroke. The weapon they developed was a marvel of brutalist functionality. It was a bank of 24 steel pipes, called spigots, arranged in a grid on the ship's bow. When fired, it launched a pattern of 65-pound projectiles arcing through the air, landing in an elliptical pattern about 200 yards ahead of the ship. The pattern was designed to blanket the area where the submerged submarine was calculated to be. The projectiles looked like small bombs with fins, and the array of spigots gave the weapon its iconic, prickly appearance. A Royal Navy officer, observing its porcupine-like silhouette, christened it the Hedgehog. But the true genius of the Hedgehog lay not just in its forward-firing capability, but in its fuse. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a preset depth regardless of proximity to a target. Each Hedgehog projectile was armed with a contact fuse. It would only detonate if it physically struck a solid object, the hull of a submarine. This changed everything. The entire dynamic of the hunt was transformed. An attack with depth charges was a cacophony of sound and fury, often signifying nothing. A Hedgehog attack was the opposite. After the initial thump, thump, thump of the mortar's firing, there was only silence. The projectiles would splash into the sea and sink. If they missed, they would simply continue to the ocean floor, unarmed and inert. The silence was unnerving for the attacking crew. But if just one of those projectiles found its mark, the result was immediate and catastrophic. The small, focused charge was designed to punch through the submarine's pressure hull. A single explosion meant a confirmed hit, and a single hit was often all it took. Water, under the immense pressure of the depths, would erupt into the submarine. A small leak would become a torrent, then a flood. The lights would fail. The submarine, its buoyancy lost, would begin its final, unstoppable descent into the abyss. For the hunters, the feedback was instantaneous and unambiguous. Silence meant a miss, and they could immediately reacquire the target for another attack without having lost sonar contact. A single sharp underwater explosion meant the hunt was over. There was no need for a second pass, no question of whether the target was damaged or destroyed. The Hedgehog had transformed anti-submarine warfare from a bludgeoning art of area saturation into a precise science of surgical destruction. The British implemented the Hedgehog with growing success in the Atlantic, but it was when this technology crossed the ocean through the Lend-Lease program that its full, world-changing potential was unlocked. American industry didn't just copy the Hedgehog, it refined it, mass-produced it, and integrated it into a comprehensive killing system. U.S. Navy engineers improved the firing mechanisms, developed faster sinking projectiles to give submarines less time to evade, and linked the entire system to advanced new fire control computers. They didn't just build a better weapon, they built a better way to fight. The U.S. Navy developed new tactical doctrines built around the Hedgehog's unique capabilities. They created dedicated hunter-killer groups, combining the strengths of multiple ships and long-range patrol aircraft. A plane might spot a submarine on the surface and force it to dive, then mark its position with smoke floats. The hunter-killer group would then converge on the location. The new, purpose-built destroyer escorts, smaller and more nimble than fleet destroyers, were the perfect platforms for the Hedgehog. They would arrive on the scene, establish a firm sonar lock, and begin their deliberate, clinical approach. A new generation of sonar operators was trained, not in the old art of guessing a submarine's path, but in the new science of feeding precise data, range, bearing, and depth into the fire control computer. The process became systematic, almost mathematical. This meant that relatively green crews, fresh from stateside training, could achieve a lethality that had once required years of bitter combat experience. In a delicious historical irony, the Americans, using the Hedgehog, perfected the very wolf pack tactics that the Germans had used against them, turning the hunters into the hunted. The Atlantic became a graveyard for U-boats, and the tide of that battle began to turn. And it was this perfected, Americanized system that was about to be unleashed in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine fleet sailed on, supremely unaware that the rules of their world had fundamentally changed. Their intelligence reports on new Allied anti-submarine warfare, ASW technologies, were likely filtered through a lens of institutional arrogance. They had survived depth charges for years. They were masters of evasion, skilled at using thermal layers and ocean currents to mask their sound signature. What could this new Allied gadget possibly do that hundreds of depth charges had failed to? Their doctrine had worked flawlessly since Pearl Harbor. It had brought them glory and victory. There was no reason to change it. This rigid adherence to proven success, a strength in the early years of the war, was now a fatal flaw. They were samurai warriors who had perfected the sword, now facing an enemy who had invented the gun. May of 1943. In the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the Pacific, the war was entering a new, grinding phase. The Allies were on the offensive, island-hopping their way toward Japan. For the Japanese submarines, the mission was clear: interdict Allied supply lines, ambush carrier groups, and bleed the American war machine. They set out on their patrols with the same confidence and skill as always, but they were sailing into a new ocean, one now populated by American destroyers and destroyer escorts carrying the porcupine-like launcher on their bows. The reckoning came with shocking speed. It began on May 17th, when the submarine I-178 vanished without a trace on patrol near Australia. Then, on May 25th, the I-177 was caught and sunk. The losses began to mount, not over months, but over days. The story of the USS Fraser and the I-182 on May 29th is a perfect microcosm of this new, brutal reality. The Fraser, a new Fletcher-class destroyer, was escorting a convoy near the Solomon Islands. Its sonar operator picked up a contact. It was the I-182, a veteran submarine on its third war patrol. The old dance would have begun. The Fraser speeding up, the I-182 diving deep, the inevitable blind spot attack with depth charges, and a high probability of escape for the submarine. But the Fraser didn't play by the old rules. The destroyer's captain, Commander Elliot M. Brown, calmly brought his ship around, keeping the I-182 firmly in his sonar beam. There was no high-speed charge, just a steady, deliberate approach. From the perspective of the Japanese crew, this would have been deeply unsettling. They could hear the destroyer's screws, but the telltale rush of an imminent depth charge attack never came. There was only the relentless, methodical ping, ping, ping of the sonar echoing off their hull. They were being stalked. Then, a series of soft thumps from the surface. Not the thunder of heavy guns, but something else. Seconds later, their world ended. A pattern of Hedgehog projectiles rained down around them in the dark water. It only took one. A direct hit on the pressure hull. The explosion was small compared to a depth charge, but infinitely more lethal. It was the difference between a hammer blow and a stiletto. The sea, held back by a mere inch of steel, crashed in. There was no time for a distress call, no time to blow the ballast tanks. The I-182, with its entire crew of 88 men, simply ceased to exist, beginning its final 2-mile journey to the ocean floor. The USS Fraser circled the site, its sonar now registering only the sound of a collapsing hull and the eerie groans of dying machinery. The hunt was over in minutes. This scene was repeated again and again. The I-169, the I-174. In the space of 12 days, 7 submarines carrying over 500 souls were sent to the bottom. Each sinking was a carbon copy of the last. A confident predator, stalked by a patient hunter, and then a sudden, violent, and silent end. The psychological impact was as devastating as the material losses. For the submariners who survived their patrols, the stories that filtered back were the stuff of nightmares. They spoke of a phantom weapon. There were no colossal explosions from near misses to let you know you were being targeted. There was no warning. One moment you were cruising silently through the depths. The next, your compartment was filling with seawater, and the lights were gone forever. The hunters of the Pacific had become the hunted, stalked by a foe they couldn't see, using a weapon they couldn't hear. The Japanese Naval Command was faced with a crisis it was institutionally incapable of comprehending. The loss of 7 of their most advanced submarines and their irreplaceable veteran crews in less than 2 weeks was a catastrophe. But their response revealed a deep, cultural, and strategic paralysis. Instead of grounding their fleet, analyzing the new threat, and developing countermeasures, they continued to send their submarines out with the same tactics that were now suicidal. Why this fatal inertia? It was a combination of factors. There was the warrior code of Bushido, which emphasized fighting spirit over material concerns and often viewed technological problems as challenges to be overcome by willpower alone. There was an intelligence failure, a command structure so rigid and hierarchical that bad news traveled upwards slowly, if at all. To admit that Allied technology had decisively surpassed their own was to admit a fundamental failure, a crack in the myth of Japanese superiority. This denial was compounded by the Hedgehog's own terrifying efficiency. Because it only exploded on a direct, fatal hit, there were no damaged submarines returning to port to tell the tale. The victims simply vanished, leaving a void of information. All the High Command knew was that their elite submarine force was bleeding out, and they didn't know why. The broader implications were strategic and absolute. The loss of these crews was a wound from which the Imperial Submarine Service would never recover. These men were the result of years of investment in selection and training. They were the heart and soul of the force. Their loss created a knowledge and experience vacuum that could not be filled. Newer, less experienced crews were sent out in their place, often to meet the same swift end. The Japanese submarine, once a feared offensive weapon that had played a key role at Pearl Harbor and prowled the American coastline, was effectively neutralized. Its role was degraded. The predators were relegated to desperate supply runs, ferrying troops and ammunition to isolated island garrisons, the so-called Tokyo Express. Later in the war, their final tragic role was to become motherships for Chiton-manned suicide torpedoes, a testament to their fall from a sophisticated weapon of war to a mere delivery system for sacrificial attacks. By the war's end, the numbers told the full story. Ships equipped with the Hedgehog were credited with a kill rate of over 25%, meaning 1 out of every 4 attacks resulted in a destroyed submarine. The rate for traditional depth charges was less than 7%. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It was a revolution in lethality. The dominoes, set in motion by Britain's desperation in the Atlantic, had cascaded across the globe and toppled one of the Japanese Empire's most formidable assets. The story of the Hedgehog mortar is a powerful and timeless lesson in the dynamics of conflict. It teaches us that wars are not won by the side with the best technology at the start, but by the side that can learn, adapt, and innovate the fastest. The Japanese Navy had entered the war with a superb submarine and a world-beating torpedo. They had mastered the existing paradigm of underwater warfare, but they failed to appreciate that the paradigm itself could change, and change with breathtaking speed. They became victims of their own success, trapped by a doctrine that had worked so brilliantly right up until the moment it became a catastrophic failure. Today, the broken hulls of the I-174, the I-182, and their sister submarines lie in the crushing darkness of the Pacific floor. They are more than just forgotten relics of a long-ago war. They are silent monuments to a fatal underestimation. They serve as an eternal warning that the most dangerous threat is never the one you have trained to defeat, but the one you have failed to imagine. It is the quiet, unassuming innovation that changes the rules of the game without warning. For the elite submarine predators of the Imperial Japanese Navy, that innovation came in the form of a strange, porcupine-like weapon that spoke only once, and whose single word was death. This chapter of naval history is filled with countless stories of ingenuity and sacrifice. What other game-changing technologies from history do you think are underrated or forgotten? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shaped our world, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new exploration into the past. Join our community of history enthusiasts, and together, let's continue to uncover the lessons buried in the archives of time.